All right. Oh, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you all for your patience as we worked out our technical difficulties with this first back mostly in person Berman Institute Bioethics Seminar Series. And welcome everyone back to the building. It's so exciting to see everybody. So I am delighted to introduce our first seminar speaker of the fall series, John Evans. He is the Tata Chancellor's Chair in Social Sciences, Professor of Sociology, Associate Dean of Social Sciences, and co-director of the Institute of Practical Ethics at UCSD. He's been a visiting member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, postdoctoral fellow at Yale, held visiting professorial fellowships or honorary professorships at the University of Edinburgh, Munster, Ben Gurion, I mispronounced that, and he's the author of 6 books and over 50 articles, and today he's going to tell us about the 7th book, although he told me before this that he has the 8th book already partially underway. His research focuses on a number of areas, all of which concern the foundational humanistic questions behind scientific and technological development. And he also is the leader on a sociological study of the relationship between religion and science, an area where he co-leads a small scholarly network and a $2.9 million regranting project. A number of his research projects are sociological studies of the public's views of the foundational questions in technology, such as what is a human and what is enhancement. Today, he's going to talk with us, as I said, about his 7th book, and about the ethics of human brain organoids and human animal neural chemicals. Please join me in welcoming John Evans.
Well, thank you very much, Deborah, for that generous introductions. It's great to be back here today. I don't remember when it was last, but let's just say I was here 7 years ago or something. Today I'll be talking about this forthcoming book. It is not available yet on Amazon, but if you're interested, make a note for yourself. Look in the next few months. For every book I sell, I make $1. And for those of you familiar with academic publishing, if I make $600 at the end of this, that will be a major success. So I want to do some qualifiers. One, I'm not a scientist. I rely upon scientists to tell me what's possible. I'm not a philosopher or a theologian. I'm actually a sociologist with just enough knowledge of philosophical and religious ethics to be dangerous. Most of my research projects involve either discourse analysis of interviews, archival analysis, or quantitative analysis of surveys. I'm going to lead pretty heavily on a survey today. So this is an outline of, believe it or not, I'm going to cover all of this in my short amount of time I have, and I promise some of it goes faster. When you see orange, that's where I am. So if you blink out for a little bit, just look at orange, that's where we are. So what am I talking about? Let's start with human brain organoids, which are 3-dimensional assemblages of human neural cells grown in the laboratory from stem cells. So imagine you take some skin from someone's hand, coax the cells into reverting to stem cells. Stem cells are the basic cells from which all cells are created. You then coax this into thinking it's a brain cell. What if you took the cells from someone with a genetically derived neurological disease? You would then end up with an organoid that had the genetics of that disease. Scientists have done this with many neurological disorders. They are currently very small, about 4 to 5 millimeters in diameter. There are limitations on these becoming full-blown versions of a human brain. Number one, they do not have blood vessels to supply oxygen or nutrients or remove waste, so their size is going to be limited until that problem is solved. More importantly, organoids are only from one part of the brain. Your entire brain is a symphony of communication between different parts. Perhaps more importantly, anything like consciousness requires interaction with the environment, and these have no way to interact yet. But people are working on the vascularization problem, which will make them grow larger and more complex. It turns out, if you put organoids from different parts of the brain next to each other, they form links between themselves, creating an assembloid. There are also the slightest hints at interaction. Turns out that these things emit electrical signals, like if you connected yourself to an EEG machine, One experiment by a university found that they emit electrical signals like a human fetus in utero. Another experiment attached to retinal cells. When you shine light on the retinal cells, you get different electrical output. Another put one of these in a little robot that's shaped like a spider, and you have it walk around the room. So this is obviously not interaction like we're having here, but it is possible to imagine in 5 to 10 years there'll be some rudimentary form of interaction. Let's continue on. What is this chimera? A chimera is a non-human animal with human cells in it. The term chimera comes from ancient mythology, which is full of not only animal-to-animal chimeras, but horses with wings, but human-animal chimeras. There are at present no centaurs, but the current reality is less dramatic. There's a long history of creating human-animal chimeras where the mix is not in the brain. For example, scientists have tried to create pigs with human-like internal organs that can be transplanted to humans. This here is a picture of a humanized mouse. The mouse with a human-like immune system is used in medical experimentation. I'm not going to really talk about non-neural chimeras, but I'm going to focus on neurochimeras. This means a non-human animal with some human neural cells in it. How could you do that? Well, scientists have taken human brain organoids and put them into mice brains. In one of these experiments, the mice got smarter, by mouse standards at least. It is anticipated that soon it will be possible to use a technique that takes a mouse blastocyst, let's say 200 cells, that will grow into a fetus and then a mouse. You destroy the cells in the blastocyst that would become the mouse brain, you put in human stem cells, and the mouse brain would be partly made of human cells. If you can do this with mouse, you could probably do it with a monkey. Experiments are underway on the background techniques to do this in monkeys, but not yet with human tissue. You could use genetic engineering to put human genes in the cells of a mouse brain. So the difference in these methods, I'm not going to talk about because they don't really have ethical relevance. And again, just to be clear, to use Hank Greeley's example, a human mouse neural chimera is not going to stand up and say, "Hi, I'm Mickey." And there's a number of reasons for this. Mice do not have speech. Second, you compare the size of a mouse skull with a human skull. Just that is going to produce differences alone. Most notably, mouse cells go from blastocyst to actual mouse in 25 days. And in humans, it takes 9 months. So whatever that developmental difference is, no one actually knows what you would get if you gestated a human for 25 days, but needless to say, no one has any idea what to do here. One source of the heightened concern of this is not mice, but non-human primates like monkeys, which are obviously much closer, evolutionary speaking, to humans, more similar skull size, gestational period, and so on and so forth. Research on this is underway right now in China. So, why would you do this? Let's start with the obvious. The reason is that these are both what are called human brain substitutes. And the ethical reason is to conduct medical research to alleviate human suffering caused by neurological disease and disorders. Why do we need these substitutes? As one scientist recently told me, it's a great time to be a mouse with Alzheimer's disease. And what does that mean? It means scientists have developed all sorts of great treatments for things like Alzheimer's that work great in mice. But turns out that while the bodies of mice are fairly similar to humans, their brains apparently are not. So the Alzheimer's drugs work great in mice, but not in humans. You think about this evolutionary, this kind of makes sense. Like the really thing that separates us from mice is the brain. Again, warning, I'm a sociologist. I actually don't know what I'm talking about, but let's just assume that that's true. There's a ton of people working on all these problems. To get these treatments to work, we need to test treatments on live human brains. Okay, but one of the challenges here is that we cannot do preliminary experimental research on live humans because we cannot ask live people to have parts of their brain removed, for example. So where do we get live human brain tissue to do basic research? Human brain organoids and neurochimeric animals are human brain substitutes that can ethically be experimented upon. So therefore, everything I'm going to say today is about a real ethical dilemma. On the one side are people suffering from neurological diseases, but we should not do absolutely everything for health. There are a number of, let's call them more narrow ethical questions. These are not unique to this particular issue. One, are you opposed to medical experimentation on animals? If so, you would have gotten off this train long ago. What level of consent is required to grow an organoid from someone's abandoned tissue? Some stem cell lines that are growing away in labs are of unknown origin. Do you have to reconsent the people and ask if it's okay to grow an organoid from their cells? Thirdly, if you create a mouse that's so smart that it's as smart as a pig, should you treat that animal more respectfully by giving it more social environment than we would for other advanced test animals? And finally, what are the evidentiary standards for societal safety? These are all really important, but I'm not going to focus on these today. What I want to ask for starters is, I'm going to be comparing the ethical views of professional ethicists with the public. And the reason for that is that at least in the US, the ethicist views have more weight in what actually happens with public policy. For example, the US government will consult with ethicists to decide whether it will fund neurochimeric research. Since the professionals have the dominant voice, they're useful in comparison with the public. I'm also playing with the tension in a bioethics discipline, which is that in the US, it claims authority to speak to public policy bioethics because it represents the views of the public through various mechanisms that I've enumerated earlier in my career. So it's useful to know the extent to which the representatives of the people have different views from the people. So the rest of my talk is comparing the ethical concerns of the academic bioethical debate with that of the public. How do I determine what academics believe? This part is really easy, which is that they write everything down and publish it. It's available on the internet. This is the easiest social science data gathering of all time. Public's not so easy. To determine the general public's ethics on these issues, I first conducted 35 in-depth interviews with a stratified sample from the public in what's called cognitive testing of the survey. The cognitive testing was used to build a nationally representative survey that used experimental vignette designs. With this design, I can make claims about what the public thinks, not whether or not they would accept the framing of an issue that an ethicist gives them, which is a subtle distinction in what's going on here. I'll skip a lot of the details here, lots of hand waving. There's a very long appendix to the book you can buy and check out my post hoc weighting sample strategy, blah, blah, blah. When doing research in an area where there's not existing research and where there's not been extensive discussion in the public, there's not one survey question that's going to definitively produce an answer. This is particularly true with abstract concerns that I think are behind most ethical debates in biological sciences. So while it's difficult to assess these abstract concerns to the public, it's important to try to do so because I think this is what's really driving the public's concerns about technology. So it's inevitable that individual analyses have like different interpretations, but when all these are put together, I think we have a pretty clear picture of what's going on. So I use an experimental vignette. There's been a number of advantages when investigating these abstract social issues. The idea is to use randomization to avoid confounding factors. This is like a clinical trial in medicine. For a COVID vaccine trial, we might worry that the vaccine worked because of the racial background of the trial participant or their educational level, what they do for a living, or any other explanations. But we don't worry about that because we take all the participants and randomly assign them to treatment and control groups. So if fewer of the people in the treatment arm get sick, then we have evidence that the vaccine worked due to random selection. It is by definition not correlated with the other characteristics of the participants. And a vignette survey design uses the same logic. A vignette is a paragraph-long description in a survey where survey respondents are randomly assigned to see particular chunks of text. At the end of the vignette, the respondent is typically asked, do you approve of this technology? So for example, the first sentence of the organoid vignette is, a human brain organoid is a blank piece of a human brain. Half the respondents saw a 1/2 inch and half saw a 5-inch. I know that a 5-inch organoid is not possible right now. We could talk about that later if you'd like. Critically, and this is critical, they do not know that the other respondents see something different than what they saw. This controls for what sociologists call presentation of self issues. They can't game out what the analyst is looking for. This is for a very similar reason why in the vaccine trial, you do not tell the participant if they're in the treatment or control arms, because doing so might change their behavior. If those who saw 5-inch are more opposed than those who saw half-inch, then we can be confident that the size of an organoid is determinant of an ethical evaluation. So a number of other features of the paragraph vary as well, which I will gloss over for now. But let's just say there are 64 possible randomly generated vignettes that a respondent could have been assigned to see. So in the description in the survey, it looks like this. I underline for you the parts that randomly change, so the respondent does not see any underlying. So this is one of the possible of the 64, okay? And I will not, you can read faster than I can talk, so go ahead and read that. So half the respondents saw that one had been created, half saw 10,000. Half saw that they were grown, half saw that they were manufactured. Half saw the debate was about whether they would have obtained self-awareness, half saw awareness of its surrounding. I mean, for those of you up on the philosophy of consciousness, those are two different notions of consciousness. In the book, I analyze all these variations, which correspond to different theories of what drives support or opposition. And I don't have time to get into all these, but we'll address the last one, which is what the level of consciousness may be. And in this example, it's the level of an insect. Each respondent only sees one of these, so they're not aware of the other possible pieces of text. After the vignette, the respondents first ask, with their agreement, research into human brain organoids should continue. That's the dependent variable. So the most basic answer to the public ethics is this. Averaging across all the possible vignettes that they see, there's overwhelming support for brain organoid research. At least that's how I described it to them, okay? But that's not all we need to know. We need to know why the public reaches this conclusion and who approves and who does not approve. Who is on the 2 down there, or the 1 or the 3, okay? Or who is in the 4 and who's in the 5. So let's also do the same thing for neurochimeras. The parts that are underlying changed. You can read that quickly. Half the respondents saw subspecies, half saw dozen. Half saw monkey, half saw mouse. There were 4 different versions of how the animal was changed, including the one showed here about the tissue implant. A third saw these described as humanized mouse or monkey, depending on what they saw with the animal, a chimera or sea beer, okay? For those of you not up on your advanced science, actually in your science fiction, sea beer is a made up term that I stole from a fanzine website about imaginary animals. So it's critical that that does not make any sense scientifically. It's just a made up term, okay? So right after I asked this, I said, do you disagree, strongly disagree, et cetera, with the statement, I support the creation of these, and then chimeras, okay? Some people saw humanized, some people saw sea bears, okay? Depending on what they saw. So again, the empirical question is whether you get more agreement from respondents who are randomly assigned to see different versions. The most obvious one is you would expect the people who see monkey to be less supportive than the people who see mouse. People generally tend to think monkeys deserve more respect than mice. So averaging across all those descriptions, that's the result for neurochimeras, which is a lot more mixed conclusion, still on the agree side though. So let me finally turn to the ethical debate. Why are these controversial? So let me start with the concern of the ethics community. The first media stories in these technologies quote ethicists who state their concern that organoids would become human. Now, no one thinks that they would become biologically human. What this has meant is that they would be human morally, not physically. This reflects one of the assumptions used in academic ethics, which is that a human, what a human is, which is an entity with certain capacities. More technically, this is what philosophy would call a personhood. So in this theory, species is not important to how we treat an animal, be it humans or other animals. What's important is the capacities that they have. Therefore, Some biological humans, like those in permanent comatose states or fetuses, lack moral status because they lack critical capacities and thus could be destroyed. Anyone who signed an advanced directive is familiar with the logic here. You list a certain number of capacities. If you don't have them, you do not want to be kept alive. Some animals, like chimpanzees, have a lot of these valued capacities and thus are treated differently by us humans. Therefore, an organoid or neurochimera would obtain the moral status of a human if it obtained key capacities of a human. And the floor, the absolute floor, before we can even start talking about this, is consciousness. Like, if it doesn't have consciousness, is essentially object-like. So, for example, a news article describing a mouse that had human brain organoid implanted in its brain, Hank Greeley stated that the question was whether you're creating something human-ish that you have to take seriously in terms of according it dignity and respect and figuring out what that even means. Or talking about a neurochimeric mouse, someone else states that if we give them human cerebral organoids, what does that do to their intelligence, their level of consciousness, even their species identity? The article continues that the animals might become too human due to the human brain components. Hank and his colleagues set the standard for whether you could transform a mouse into a man by whether it was a creature with some aspects of human consciousness or some distinctly human cognitive abilities. Similarly, Chen and colleagues write that one of the primary concerns centers on the possibility animals transplanted with human brain organoids would become more human. Their ethical concerns are due to their being increasingly similar to the human brain, the source of higher order cognitive capacities, the most often equated with being human. So from the perspective of bioethical debate that actually influences policy, this is the primary, really the only ethical question. Again, due to the assumptions that bioethicists have in their discipline. So here's an example. This is the charge given to the National Academies of Science Committee meant to evaluate the ethics of these technologies. And for the purposes of transparency, I have to mention I was on this committee, but to foreshadow the ethical, everything you see in red here are about consciousness, and the rest of them, the things that are about the sort of ethics of the public, as we will see, are not on this list. It was thought that the primary thing we should be concerned about is whether either of these could obtain some modicum of consciousness. Now you want to know, what is consciousness? And I'm not going to tell you, okay? This is a debate, very little consensus. It's been going on for centuries, for which you could spend at least one career examining, and I have absolutely no qualifications to engage in it. People in the bioethical debate recognize that operationalizing consciousness, let alone measuring it, is going to be unbelievably difficult. And I'm just going to sort of leave it at that. So this is what the ethics community believe is the moral problem. What about the public? So I'll just tell you from a previous study that I did showed the public uses a different definition of the human than do ethicists. My present project contains many analyses, and I'm just going to use a few exemplars for you to get a sense of how I'm making these claims. So let's look at the survey. So after the organoid vignette, I asked whether they approve of the research. I also asked whether after the research is done, the organoid could be destroyed, which is a pretty good marker of moral status. In the bioethics argument, more consciousness means more moral status. Similar, like you give more moral status to chimpanzees than to mice, and some animals have such low status you don't even have to get permission from a committee to experiment on, worms and things like this. The question is, did people who saw slightly different vignettes have different responses to these questions? 1/4 saw that an organoid could one day obtain the consciousness of an insect. 1/4 saw a pig, 1/4 saw a human fetus. The comparison condition to these analyses is they would never obtain consciousness. So the chart I'm about to show is what's called predicted values, okay? What percent of those who saw no consciousness said they approve or strongly approve of organoid research? And this is statistics controlling for everything else in the model, and this is the predicted value of the regression equation. So What percentage would agree, strongly approve? 69% if it would not obtain consciousness. 54 said it would be okay to destroy the organoids when done. If you go down each column, if people were really concerned about consciousness, there would certainly be a difference in approval of technology or in the willingness to destroy an organoid when the experiment is done. But there is not, as the difference between these numbers is very small, and statistically the numbers are the same. For example, the same percent approve of this research, whether described as never obtaining consciousness or obtaining the consciousness of a human fetus. This does not support the consciousness theory because increasing consciousness does not change the moral status for the public. So it's critical to know here that each respondent did not see the other descriptions. They had no idea it was asking about human fetus if they saw insect, for example. This is closer to the public's, not perfectly, but it's closer to the public's unadulterated opinion. And I spent a lot of time, talking about this in the book. So let's turn to neurochimeras. Same sort of logic. After the neurochimera, I said, we should treat these humanized, whatever I ended up calling them, better than we treat other mice or monkeys. This gets at the moral status of the entity. Would people give the entity more moral status if it's described in various ways? Then you have assessing what they think is morally important. So there are three that could have been randomly assigned to C: immune system, brain tissue from a human, brain tissue like a human. The final one is a very subtle distinction that I'll not get into. But if consciousness matters, then we should see people thinking that animals with human brain tissue should be treated better than those with the human immune system. 26% who saw the change as having human immune system agreed, strongly agreed, but the numbers of the other two are statistically the same. The possibility of human consciousness is not particularly relevant for the public. I turn to chimeras for a bit. The primary concern is different for organoids and chimeras. When social scientists hear of a neurochimera, their thoughts don't turn to consciousness. Knowledge of Western cultures would suggest that the public's main ethical concern will be the foundational divide between humans and animals. So societies have foundational cultural distinctions that are so deeply assumed that it's difficult for members of the society to even see. So in the West, some basic ones have been man, woman, mind, body, nature, culture, human object, and of course, human animal. So one way to recognize something that violates a foundational distinction is that it is the subject of fear, disgust, and fascination. Key is fear. In anthropological terms, something that violates a distinction is impure, unclean, and there are taboos surrounding it. At its extreme, it must be destroyed in order to maintain the distinction. Some people may think that they lack such distinctions, but the most influential anthropologist of this topic, Mary Douglas, wrote her books to show that it's not only quote unquote primitive societies that hold the foundational distinctions, but ours do too. Popular culture plays with these distinctions because they elicit such a reaction, because they allow us to think about these issues. Let's look at a few versions. The thing on the left is a plastinate, which is an actual human body with the skin removed and encased in plastic. A lot of people have a kind of response to this, which means it is violating the sort of in-out distinction that some people think is actually hardwired into us. The one on the right is a zombie, which violates the living dead distinction and structures the thought of almost all Western societies. Frankenstein monster violated the living dead distinction. This is why it was such an object of fascination and critically why the villagers decided they wanted to kill it. Human animal distinction is also foundational, although many advocates of animal rights would like to remove this distinction. Chimeras work so well in mythology because they give us this sense of revulsion and fear. These are two famous neurochimeras, Planet of the Apes, and for those of you who watch television during this very unfortunate era, that is Mr. Ed, okay, who is a talking horse who only Wilbur can understand what he's saying. TV really was bad back in the day. Again, you recognize a foundational distinction when you generate a sense of emotion or disgust. So I'm gonna do my test. Everyone, so what's that? Yeah, okay, so everyone gets like, what is that? Okay, it's an artist's rendition of a mix between a human and a pig. Okay, if you had that yuck response, you have this distinction, even if you'd like to deny it. And I should add, professions teach people to not have these distinctions. There's an entire medical sociology literature on how doctors are trained to not have the in-out distinction, or you couldn't be a surgeon, okay? That's partly what medical school does. It's been argued that's what the cadaver lab does. It doesn't teach you where the parts are or whatever, okay? In another study I did, I showed that it generally holds to these foundational distinctions between humans and animals. So I'm not the first person to point this out. Robert and Bayless talk about this. I'll let you read that really quickly. So a critical problem is that neurochimeras violate the boundary between humans and animals. Is that true for the public? So you cannot have an entire survey that's just vignettes, or the thing of the comprehension would drop to the floor, or the thing would be as long as War and Peace. One of these standard survey questions I ask is, in general, humans are more similar to animals than they are different. This is a general measure of people acknowledging a divide between humans and animals. The chart shows the percent of those who most see a human-animal divide, who approve of neurochimeric research, and the next row, those who least agree with the divide. So we see that the human-animal divide, the people who agree with the human-animal divide are much less approving of neurochimeras than those who do not see such a strong divide. Seeing a foundational distinction between humans and animals makes you lean against chimeric research because it mixes what should not be mixed. Similarly, if those who do not see a foundational divide who want to treat a chimera better, that see it can be upgraded through addition of human qualities. Those who see a foundational divide are more likely to think that a mouse should always be treated like a mouse, no matter what you add to it. This effect is relatively large by survey standards, actually. So I have one final piece to show here. In the neurochimera vignette, 1/3 of the respondents saw, of the 3 possible terms to describe the neurochimera: humanized, mouse monkey, chimera, or sea-beer. And again, what percentage approve or strongly approve of the research? So when the entity is described as human, you get the least amount of approval of the research. You get the most approval of the research when you have this term sea-beer, okay, which doesn't track into anyone's knowledge at all. I would argue that when you call something human, you are essentially invoking for the respondent that this is violating the human-animal distinction. You're generating this response. So to sum up this section, members of the public who see a foundational divide between humans and animals are more likely to oppose neurochimeric research. Since a very large fraction of the public believes in this divide, this is, I think, one of the explanations for public opposition. So I'm moving through pretty fast here. So you get to the orange here. Let's turn to the public's view of organoids. In bioethical and scientific debate, disembodied human tissue has no moral status. If you had a tumor removed from your body, it's not treated as sacred in any way, but is burned as medical waste. When medical sociologists and anthropologists hear about something like an organoid, they think of something besides possible consciousness. Sociological and anthropological studies show that the public does not view disembodied human parts as fully alienated from the original human. Studies show a good portion of the public thinks a human retains a connection to disembodied parts. So sociologists have asked blood donors that thought the blood was still theirs. Half the sample had this medical or bioethical view, which is it's alienable, it's gone. Others believed in a continuity of possession. One respondent said the blood would always be mine, it will always stay my blood, kind of like a perpetual loan. Other respondents see the link as something like parent to child, saying it's like children, they may grow up and be your own person, but you're still my child. This is more than a property relation. So the ethical debate is concerned about the relation being a sort of a legal property relation, but that's not what I'm talking about here. The strongest version of this is almost communicative. For the blood group, there was some who said it was the bearer of personality or moral disposition. Similarly, a study of tissue specimen donation, researchers found one category of resistance was the idea that biospecimens are an extension of the self. For those who talk this way, the physical nature of biospecimens retains an individual's essence. The strongest version of this has been organ donors. It's been long found that recipients share the belief that some of the psychic and social qualities of the donor are transferred with his or her organ to the person when it was implanted. Gil Haddow summarized this literature as claiming changes in gender or behavior, resurgence of youth, or discovering new tastes and preferences are often attributed by transplant recipients to the act of taking an organ from one person and transplanting it to the other. So, does this exist for the public? An organoid is grown from the cells of an existing person, and that's how I described it to people, at least. It is disembodied human tissue, like an organ. From a scientific perspective, it's 4 millimeters lump of tissue in a dish. But I think these ephemeral connections are what's actually going on here. After the organoid vignette, I asked the respondent to evaluate human brain organoids should be thought of as an extension of the person who donated the cells to make it. So that's a lot of agreement for something like that, okay? And so most people think it's an extension of some sort. The stronger version was, do you think we have the thoughts of the person? Again, very strong. Now, of course, we can say that, you know, the general public does not understand science. Yes, absolutely agreed, but that's besides the point, okay? The question is what people's response is to this. I mean, eventually, if they learn enough about this, they might, you know, not hold this position, but this is the initial position. So, a look at the extent of agreement with destroying organoids or that they should be treated better. So the comparison on the left is agreeing or disagreeing that an organoid is an extension, and then the other one is whether or not it would have the thoughts of the donor. Let's look at the left column at the top. Thinking that organoids are an extension is associated with much less agreement with destroying the organoid. Let's look at the left column at the bottom. Thinking that organoids could have the thoughts of a cell donor is associated with not wanting the organoids to be destroyed. There's a weaker effect in the extensions, but people who make this ephemeral connection clearly gives more status to the organoid. We can also see in the treat organoids, they're more likely to treat humans question. There's obviously an enormous difference with extension. You see that? That is not an artifact. I've checked it like so many days, all day long. It is not a statistical artifact. It's an extreme effect. So we can understand the public does not understand human biology, but to be clear, also the public are not absolutist. There's no one who thinks an organoid is human. Rather, it's a tendency, a shading, a source of discomfort, an ethical concern the public has that sends them a few more steps towards hesitancy. And a first impression is that these disembodied parts retain some connection to the donor, which impacts how we should treat them. So I'm here at Hopkins, and I decided I should speak to a Hopkins topic, which is there appears to be a flagship research area here, which is using human organoids as powerful computers. This is basically using like a farm of human brain organoids with electrical inputs and outputs to create more powerful computers, like a human biological computer. This is obviously not yet possible, but many serious scientists are trying to pull it off. And needless to say, the ideas of brains in a vat has been subject to extensive public imagery as well. Probably the most famous book in bioethics is called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Lacks was a Black woman who was the source of the HeLa cell line that has been used extensively in medical research for decades. The usual interpretation of the book is that racism and classism resulted in Henrietta and her family not being asked about the use of the cells and certainly not sharing in any of the profits. All true. But the book also shows extensively that her family has pretty standard American views about the ephemeral connections between actual humans and their parts. The book's author reports that when Lax's daughter found out that scientists had been using HeLa cells to study viruses, she imagined her mother eternally suffering the symptoms of each disease. In another scene, the family members are shown a freezer full of the cells, and one of her children says, "I can't believe that all that's my mother." When handed a vial of frozen cells, Lax's daughter says she's cold. At another point, the daughter looking through the microscope says, "That's my mother." No one seems to get that. When I read documents on organoid computing, these scenes from Lax's family come to mind, and I think people who are going to have a similar response to a room of thousands of organoids in it producing supercomputing power. At least for Lax, her disembodied parts were used to relieve the suffering of human disease. And I worry that people are not going to see increased brain power as something to counterweight the concern about ephemeral connections to humans. So, conclusions. I have summarized the ethical debate by speaking very quickly, but human brain organoids. For the academic bioethicist, the most important consideration is whether an entity could obtain a consciousness to warrant different treatment or its extreme treatment like a human. My survey suggests that possible consciousness is not very critical for the public. The public tends to adhere, secondly, to a foundational distinction between humans and animals, and the survey suggests the divide is important and a reason for opposition to neurochimeric animals. And finally, the public sees possible connections between disembodied human parts and actual humans. This connection gives a degree of resistance to organoid research. The public is also concerned about people suffering from neurological disease and support research that will reduce this suffering. Hence, we have an ethical dilemma. As the research goes forward, I think we need to be aware of the reasons for the public ethical concern so that research can advance in a way most consistent with the public's ethics. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so very much. And I'm going to take questions now. I will start with one. I'm very impressed with the data about the difference between what bioethicists think is important and what your sample of the public thinks is important. This isn't the first time there's been a disconnect. This is a profound disconnect.
Right.
What do you think another bioethicist should take from that?
Yes, I think that you should take from that literally that consciousness is not very important, and that I do think what's important is to consider these views of the public. I have a longstanding view that bioethics as a discipline or a profession should be about the sort of precise application of the public's values to actual problems. The public cannot be expected to learn about organoids and develop all the knowledge it takes. They got jobs, they've got things to do, okay? And if you ask people about it, if they give you an answer, they don't know because they don't know the science, okay? But they know their values. The public knows their values. And so I would say you find out what their values are, and then I think ethicists are presented with some new problem, you should use that as part of what is under consideration. So I think it would be better to figure out what, in a more deep sense, what's going on with the public's views, and then to make sure that research is going forward takes care of that. So let me also sort of say, like, the organoid in the dish, if your average member of the public says, okay, I can use this to plausibly come up with a cure for Alzheimer's, people would actually say, yeah, we can. But try to do it in such a way that otherwise fits with my values.
That gave everyone plenty of time.
Is that one of my co-authors? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, thanks, John, for a really interesting talk. I am a social sociologist too, so I'm interested in your survey, not the technical methodologic aspects of it, but the characteristics that you decided to include and not include in your randomization. And sort of as a follow-up to what was just said before about people being really worried about Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease, and yes, they thought it could be go for it. My reaction is, by when? And, Deborah knows this, I've been involved in the Human Genome Project since the beginning in 1990, and I will never forget Francis Collins saying, we will have a cure for cancer within 5 years. And we're still not there. So I'm just wondering what you think you might find if one of your randomization points was sort of the likelihood of having an impact on disease and by when.
Yeah. Great question. So you're limited to the number of factors you can stick in somebody's vignettes. They get too complicated, like mathematically. But what I did was I thought to myself, like, what would the public be presented with the day they read about this for the first time? That's what I'm trying to get at. And so I basically mirrored the debates that you would see, okay? I didn't include this one, and you had another factor, which is, and this research will come to fruition in some people see 5, some see 10, 20, 50 years. I'm pretty certain, I don't have any data for this, I'm pretty certain it'd be a linear effect of like the further distance, it'd be like much less importance to research, other things that they come before. I mean, it's like this classic thought experiment. You know, if you saw the baby drowning in a puddle in front of you, what would you do? Right? So, like, if they create these organoids tomorrow, and then next week your mother is cured from Alzheimer's, you have huge support. I think most people are kind of aware of the contingency of all of this, as all demonstrated by the Human Genome Project, stem cells. You know, Christopher Reeve would walk again, right? And so, yeah, point well taken. I didn't include that one. It would be interesting to do a study. I could design a study right now that would be like, what is the public's view of the sort of research horizon and moral value, right? You do it for different technologies. So what does the public have like a hinge where at some point it's like, oh, it's too far in the future? That's a good question.
You want us to just pass down?
So thanks, John. Travis Jr., I'm a philosopher. So I have a very like inchoate philosophy question.
Yep.
For the social scientists who thought about this, tried to investigate it at all. So I'm also really impressed by the discount. So impressed and really be true. Right. So one thought that I wonder if you tried to study is you noted how hard it is to define consciousness. Right. And so my thought is just that it's kind of implicit in all the other things we talk about, like that the thing is minimally conscious or more conscious or something is what makes it possible for it. Like it's a part of me that's going to pass on, you know, or what is going on. Right. Well, you see where I'm going.
Yeah.
Right? So I just wonder if there's a way to try to tease out. It really feels like they do care that it's conscious. It's just not how they're thinking about it.
So let me add one big wrinkle from the book, which is that I like to make a distinction in my work between what the public will agree to if you ask about it and what they would do on their own. Okay, so actually, when you have questions about consciousness, if you ask questions like, do you think it's important to avoid creating organoids that are conscious? You would have a lot of agreements on that. Okay. And so this is a classic problem in sociology where you essentially, people will give you an answer if you spit out to them what you want, they'll spit it back to you. Okay. And so the experimental begins meant to avoid that problem. And so that's one thing, which is I have no doubt that the public could be convinced that consciousness is really important. But at present, that's not, and then I have a sort of democratic theory of that, which is you should go with what the public actually thinks is the way you convince them to think. Separate topic for conversation. As for consciousness, I thought you were going to the point which is totally legit critique. I just say consciousness. Like I don't tell them what that means. The question is, does the public have an intuitive sense of what consciousness means and a definition as precise as what the philosophical community has, which is pretty abstract in itself. So I think, yeah, I mean, I think that's a legitimate critique of my entire enterprise.
In that case, that's what I asked.
I didn't define it very, very properly. Now, the other thing, of course, is that you're asking essentially what's the interaction effect, which is like, would people who saw consciousness have a better sense of connection to the thing? And I didn't do that. And it's too late now, the book's coming out. But that's a good idea. Where were you 6 months ago? You're
Thanks. Or it's you wrote that.
And paper bill.
So I mentioned that my question is coming out because it, in a lot of ways, builds on lots of things you've been saying in answer to other people's questions. I'm going to sneak into the answer only the first one if you want. I didn't write it down, slides went by quickly, but my recollection is that the first two questions that you showed us, how would you feel about blah, 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 if it helped with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's? Was framed differently from the second one that said something like, if it helped with human disease.
Yeah, right.
And I'm with Gail that I want to vary the outcome. For me, it's not the time span. But it's the, I think there are all sorts of things people would find acceptable if it were relevant to Alzheimer's.
Right.
And I think human disease sounds like science and research, like, yeah, you guys, good luck.
Hmm.
So obviously in ethics, we are so often looking at both sides of something to figure out what's acceptable. It's not like, is it okay to cut you open? It's like, is it okay to cut you open so that I can pick out that cancerous mass?
Right.
And so I just would love to see that in a future set of experiments, or keep that so that constant. Right. Here it says lead to cures for human diseases. The last one will lead to Alzheimer's. So
Yep. So, good point. Where were you when I was designing this? So, defense number one is that I can't and don't ever directly incorporate analysis of these two big X in the same analysis. So it's comparisons that people saw the same thing. And so I think the question to ask is, would I get different results on this one instead curing Alzheimer's?
right.
And I read it again. I would say
Because sorry, there you did say to us, now we're moving from the mouse to the moon.
right. I think that if I would have Alzheimer's in this, the top line data would have more approval. Okay.
Right.
Remember, every survey you ever see, the analyses are perfectly dependent on the wording of the question. That's why sociologists never show top line results essentially. They just show comparisons between groups of people who saw the same question, the same words. Okay. But this would move that line, I have no doubt. But here's the deeper question. Would it change the effects within this? Would it change people's orientation towards C, chimera or severe? I'm guessing not. It'd be pretty, I can't think the theory would suggest that the actual effects would be different, but I have no doubt the general approval would change. In the same way that if I remove the whole thing about human disease, if scientists are doing this and not saying why, the amount of disapproval would just skyrocket. But yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I can't directly compare the two because of that. Yes.
Hey, thanks. This is really interesting. I find this survey results fascinating. But I guess I find them also very difficult to interpret, especially as an indicator of people's values. And I'm curious sort of why you sort of interpret them that way, especially because these are very complicated issues. And so there's a sense in which the interpretation of the facts might shape the evaluation in a way that's like, well, if you were spending a lot of time learning everything about chimeras and whatever else, you would come to a very different view because you would know that X, Y, Z is true. Or for instance, with giving blood, like you might learn that, well, actually that blood will be cycled out very quickly, so that won't even be there, right? And so like the initial presentation might cause one reaction, but these additional facts might cause further reactions. And so this seems really hard to interpret what's going on, especially without eliciting an explanation. Like, I think it would be valuable to also ask them for the reasons why they agree or disagree, because that could provide a lot of insight, especially for instance, with regards to the immune system versus the brain tissue. That seems to go exactly to Nancy's point, where it's like, well, if you cure brain or Alzheimer's, then that might just greatly outweigh whatever immune.
Yeah, I have those data in the book.
What?
I have them asking them.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. And pretty much all my work is based on combining in-depth interviews with surveys for this exact reason. You may not realize what we've actually done is you basically said that all of social science is impossible. So everything I say is contingent upon essentially the way that I worded that in the present. Now, no doubt that if people all of a sudden learn some biology, their view of this would change. Moreover, if all of a sudden these things start getting built in mass and people start learning more about it, it's going to be framed into the public, and so their view is going to change as well. And so this is just a snapshot of the present, given the little information that I've given them. So I would portray it as, their values now absent any further exposure to the topic, absent any changes in technology or anything else, and then it will change. That said, I think I've found over time that public views of things is actually pretty durable. Things don't really, facts about these things don't really change much unless it was some just total game changer, like, you know, the stem cell they squirted into Christopher Reeve's back and he walked off, you know. So I think it's, you know, it's not exact, but I think it's an indicator.
So
It's
I
okay,
think,
you can say the social plan shouldn't exist then.
I think this is our last question.
Okay, I'll try to make it a good one. So I'm Sarah, I'm a master's of bioethics student. I did my undergrad capstone on neuroorganoids, so I have more familiarity with this. This is really fantastic to hear today. So my question is about, so when you were surveying the public and you were asking them if they approve of research or they approve of destroying organoids, my understanding is one of the concerns about organoids sort of reaching this moral equivalent or closeness to humans is then how we treat human research subjects with similar cognitive capabilities. So I was wondering what you think even the public's reaction may be if they were instead asked, should these organoids be treated with the same research protections or treated like human research subjects with similar or like that might sort of show a stronger reaction to the cognitive consciousness of organoids. Since right now it sort of seems like it's such a separate alien concept, but it's sort of drawn more to existing humans if you think of it.
I think it would, I just can't predict which way it would go. I mean, you'd have, on the one hand, if, just in terms of interpretation of survey questions, if you suggest to the respondents that somehow these things have such consciousness that we're even asking them about whether or not they can be treated the same as human research subjects, that's going to bend all the data in one direction. On the other hand, your question itself is bending it back in the other way, which is like, well, you know, they're not going to obtain human level consciousness, so maybe I shouldn't worry about it. And so you definitely get different results. I guess I'm mostly thinking like which one is more useful for the debate. And I think it's quite clear to me that if you modify a mouse, but an organoid is never going to obtain, in my opinion, anything like consciousness. Okay. What do we mean by consciousness? Okay. And a neurochimeric animal, you know, is not going to obtain human level consciousness. I don't think. I mean, like you take a non-human primate, you take a chimpanzee, give it human components of the brain. What do I know? But I just think this way of framed is more like the more likely scenario that policymakers will be presented with in the relatively near future. That is your question.
As close as we can get. Thank you again so much. Please join me in thanking. And the next Berman Institute seminar is on Monday, October 9th. Mark Spindelman will be joining us, who's actually in our long one of our fellowship programs. Hope to see you there.